continuing our symposium, and I'm happy to introduce our plenary speaker, Professor Marslen-Wilson. However, it's even absurd to do it because he's so famous. Everybody knows him. He's a classic. But still, his studies lie in the field of comprehension of spoken language in the mind and the brain. And he uses interdisciplinary, or I would say multidisciplinary techniques that are aimed at identifying the neural processing streams that support the immediate interpretation of spoken utterances. And his current research brings together behavioral, neuropsychological, and neuroimaging data using contrasting languages, Arabic, Polish, and English among them. And all this is done to determine the underlying general principles of human language as a neurocognitive system that is located in its broader neurobiological and evolutionary context. Professor Marslen-Wilson was educated at Oxford and at MIT, and his research career has included very important posts at the University of Chicago, Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands, and the University of Cambridge, and in Birkbeck College and the University of London. And he was director of MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge from 1997 up to 2010. And he came back to a research post in the University of Cambridge in 2011. He is also a fellow of the British Academy and the Academia Europaea, and honorary professor of language and cognition at the University of Cambridge. However, I'm sure that the majority of those who are in this room know it already, so it was a formal introduction. So you're most welcome, and of course we are so grateful you could find time to come. Thank you.
I'll try not to stand in front of the screen. Well, thank you very much. I'm very sorry to those of you who missed your talks this morning. I'm afraid the 4-hour time lag did me in and I didn't wake up, despite my alarm. My apologies. I'm very pleased actually to be here in Russia. It's the first time I've been in Russia. I have links to Russia. My mother was Polish, but she disapproved of the Russians almost as much as she disapproved of the Germans, but she did try to bring me up as bilingual in English and Russian, and that apparently went quite well until I was 4 and went to school and came back and said, I'm English, I'm not speaking this foreign language, and I didn't and wouldn't and don't, I'm afraid. I must congratulate all the speakers here, by the way, on their excellent command of English. Another link, I think, to Russia. When I was a undergraduate at Oxford, inconceivably long ago, 1950s, 1960s, you know you're getting really old when the children of your graduate students themselves start applying to graduate school. But in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, the dominant traditions in Anglo-Saxon study of the brain and the mind and so forth were either non-existent or phenomenally dull because of the terrible grip of behaviorism and Skinner and so on and so forth. And there was this sort of underground, well, not so underground, there was this a great respect and interest and curiosity about Soviet science, so figures like Luria and Vygotsky and Sokolov, and because none of us could read Russian, and we couldn't even read the script, and most of the stuff would be in mimeograph translations that the United States intelligence agencies had garnered, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm very happy to be back in, and I hope a new era of opening for Soviet science, or Russian science, I should say. And final link is that, in fact, my PhD thesis was stimulated by some early work by a Russian scientist called Ludmila Chistovich, who, among other things, reported what seemed unbelievable results about the earliness with which people could repeat back spoken inputs. I mean, she and her colleagues were reporting repetition delays, so you hear something and then you say it, and people were starting to repeat what they were hearing within about 120, 130 milliseconds. Now, people thought, well, is this another of these strange reports that come out of the mysterious Soviet Union where people can read colours with their fingertips and so on and so forth? But I was sufficiently curious. This was when I was at MIT as a graduate student, and my supervisors were sufficiently curious, Jerry Fodor and Merrill Garrett, that why don't you have a look at this? And to my surprise, first of all, I could replicate it in the sense that I could find people who could repeat back what they were hearing at not 120 millisecond delays, but 200, 250 millisecond delays. And even more surprising, there's lots of evidence that they could understand what they were saying at those sorts of delays, because their output at this 200 to 250 millisecond delay this is only certain individuals are able to do this, because you need to be able to cancel out delayed auditory feedback interference to be able to do it. They're not only very accurate, 95% accurate, but also clearly, if you look at the errors and so forth, that they were computing a representation, a syntactic representation and so forth. So it really sort of very clearly said to me, language processing is a very dynamic, incremental, unreasonably rapid process. And my career since then has really been the attempt to try to come to grips with that. I have to say I've been waiting for most of those years for technology to come along that could allow me to start to look at the neural events that support these activities. And MEG, EEG, and source space will allow that. So that's why I'm generally lost in source space. But most of this research is going to be fMRI. So all sorts of links. So that's one reason for being particularly pleased to be here in Russia. So morphological systems and their neurobiological substrates. So this is really a view of what an explanatory cognitive neuroscience of human language and communication should look like. I think it needs to be founded in the neurobiological properties of the relevant brain systems. These brain systems, as neurobiological systems, have to be rooted in their evolutionary contexts, and you have to investigate these things systematically and cross-linguistically. And in fact, the more systematically you look, the more cross-linguistically, the more complex everything seems to become. But it's clearly necessary. So I'll be presenting a view of language as a dynamic coalition of interacting brain systems where core language systems are distributed, I claim, across these two systems, where different languages may distribute these functions differentially across these systems. And in doing this, I'll be focusing somewhere on the interface between morphology, lexicon, and syntax. Not much syntax, I regret to say. So, outline then, limitations in current conceptions of language as a cognitive system, this dual neurobiological framework, some relevant neuropsychological neuroimaging evidence for the existence and the separability of these two systems in the modern human, implications for language function variation, and then the main meat of it will be this focus on inflectional and derivational morphology cross-linguistically, and I think this is a very appropriate audience for me to be talking about these things, given the many languages and so forth that we've heard about, and the extent to which people are indeed interested in inflectional and derivational morphology. Strangely, there are some people out there who aren't. The base sort of social, popular and scientific concept that we have as, of language is it's a unified system. We as listeners and speakers sort of command this unitary system from which language behavior flows. And neuroscientifically, and it's a very strong phenomenological experience, just as we have a very strong phenomenological experience of a perceptual world where we see things as in the context of a unified system, although the neurobiological systems that generate our visual percepts are in fact themselves, just as in language, I'll argue, a coalition of different systems brought together in a mysterious way. So neurobiologically expressed as a biological system centered around this left hemisphere frontal temporal network, the very familiar Broca-Wernicke hypothesis, which you'll know about with this posterior left temporal area linking to this inferior frontal area, and so forth. And in one way or another, perpetuated in modern concepts of how the language system is organized and neurobiologically instantiated. And there's certainly a great deal of truth to that. This system, however one might characterize it, is absolutely core to full human language function. But it's obscured, I would argue, an equally important one, which is the role of bihemispheric systems and processes. And these need to be brought into so I haven't only started using this today, and so I have a tendency to go and press another key. So it's dual neurobiological framework where human language and communication is supported by these two intersecting evolutionary Yes, I'll fall over. If I slip, well, I hope it won't because I fainted. I just slipped. I'll try not to skate. Move everything else out of the way. So, a distributed bihemispheric system, which is common with our primate relatives, supports the dynamic interpretation of multimodal sensory inputs. So it's this basic system for interpreting sensory inputs, including auditory and visual ones, in their context for action and communication. And then there's a focused, evolutionary, later left hemisphere.
I'll watch the board for you.
I've never been treated with such deference. Thank you. Sorry about that. Focused left hemisphere frontotemporal network that is the sort of classic Broca-Wernicke, one way or another, supports core morphosyntactic linguistic functions. And the first point I want to make is that not only are these two systems, but these two systems are neuroscientifically dissociable in the modern human. Just to roughly remind you of the sort of primate neurobiological context, and the basic point is that we humans, the modern human, we're intelligent social primates, and the neurobiological systems that our existing relatives, primate relatives, have evolved in order to function in their environments as intelligent social primates, also function in our brains in order to support fundamental aspects of language and communication. So these have well-developed systems for processing complex audiovisual objects, including in particular conspecific vocalizations, vocal calls with social indexical, bidexical, I mean indicating state, embedded in complex social environments, and where there are these striking neurofunctional parallels between the macaque and the human. The macaque is because the macaque remains a primate species that is still regarded as ethically appropriate to do invasive research on. And just a couple of examples to to illustrate the sorts of systems I'm talking about and their representation in the modern human. So, for example, one quite familiar one is this notion of the overall structural organisation of the auditory object processing system, including conspecific calls. Many of you, I'm sure, will have seen this diagram, or some version of it. Goes back to work by Josef Rauschecker, Tian, and other colleagues. Well, this is the macaque brain. There's the auditory cortex running down rather than laterally in the macaque. So auditory information is coming into primary auditory cortex, and then there are these processing streams, one going dorsally round towards frontal cortex that way, and then a ventral stream running down like that. And this emerged. This is a sort of auditory version of the visual dual dorsal ventral hypothesis, which emerged about 10 to 15 years ago, and has turned out to be very influential and valuable in thinking about the organisation of the human auditory object processing system in the language context. In particular, I think what's important is the notion is that there's not just one stream going from sound to meaning, but rather there are multiple streams. There's two indicated here. The sorts of models that you see in the modern literature, for example, very well-known Hickok and Purple model, there's this strong inferior stream and so forth, and there's an extra, and so on and so forth. But you can see how the currently well-established models of how the language processing system are organised are, in fact, direct inheritors of and built on this concept that comes directly from our primate relatives. Another example comes from the sort of more social aspects of language communication, absolutely crucial. So what you see in the macaque is highly developed, and I say this is an example of a species that is worked on, highly developed audiovisual integration supporting social interaction. So here you have a picture of a macaque, and that's the eye gaze of a conspecific. This is a sort of some of the early works, the early Soviet work that we were all very impressed with 30 or 40 years ago, was in fact work on eye gaze. This is tracking the eye gaze of a macaque or a conspecific, and they start off looking around the eyes, but when they start talking, they start looking around the mouth, which is exactly what if you track human eye gaze, so look around the eyes, start talking, look around the gestures. This integration, this integration of auditory and visual inputs, so you see this in neurons and macaque auditory cortex, integrating these inputs and so forth, and very similar systems are identifiable in the modern human. So the infrastructure for the integration of cues that are coming from face-to-face interaction and through the ears and so on and so forth those are the systems on which human spoken language, face-to-face communication are built. However, it's also quite clear that primate communication systems are not comparable at all to human communication systems. If they weren't, you might see a macaque standing up here lecturing to a fellow audience about that extinct branch of a tree, the homonyms and so forth, and all we can, etc. And a key difference, clearly, is syntactic function centered around this left perisylvian system, and that must be intimately involved with the sort of grammatical core of language function, the set of grammatical devices that organize the flow of linguistic information and interpretation. And that's to a very large extent, not 100%, but a large extent dependent on this language-related cortical regions that seem to be particularly present in the modern human. If you look, as for example, Rilling did in a paper in Nature Neuroscience 5 or 6 years back, doing structural imaging on humans, chimpanzees, and macaques, and focusing in particular on this major dorsal pathway linking temporal lobes and frontal lobes, especially inferior frontal areas, where this system is critical for full language function in the modern human. You see that this system is really not present at all in the macaque. It's starting to emerge in the chimpanzee, and of course it's not just the size of the tract, but also the areas themselves are greatly expanded in the human relative to chimpanzee, and especially relative to the macaque. For example, the human has 3 lobes rather than 2 inner temporal lobes, and so forth, 3 gyri rather than lobes, and so forth. So there's that evolutionary emerging system is on which aspects of language depend, is clearly crucial. But it's not. This is in the context of other capacities. So what I want to then go through is briefly some evidence for the claim that core grammatical functions are dependent on this pericygnic system, that it's neurally irreplaceable, right hemisphere can't take over those grammatical functions, that integrates with bihemispheric capacities, and the strongest evidence for separability comes from work with patients with left hemisphere lesions, and I'm going to spend a few minutes just going over that. This is a broad distinction between morphosyntactic functions, especially syntactic functions, and more general semantic and pragmatic interpretation, and the systems that cooperate to integrate those. So this is research that done in my colleague Lorraine Tyler's lab. I would collaborate on most of these papers, but she and her group are certainly the people who did this work and took the lead on it. And what this research does in general, it takes groups of chronic stroke patients with left hemisphere damage, and it looks at, it relates where they have damage, there's a voxel by voxel structural integrity, to function as measured by fMRI activity and performance as measured in behavioral tasks. And you measure variation in performance, variation in functional activity, and variation in structural integrity, and you integrate the 3 of them in order to reach conclusions about the brain systems that support different aspects of neural activity. And they're using 2 measures of performance. One is an online word monitoring task, goes back to some of our very early work, but it's still valuable. And it focuses on syntax and sentence meaning, measuring word position effects, WPE. And what I'm particularly interested in here is word position effects in anomalous prose. She was writing to use the collage of a fish she opened last week, which can be interpreted prosodically and syntactically up to a point, but has no overall sentential meaning. And it's a comparison between monitoring later and earlier in anomalous prose as opposed to a string of random words where there's no incremental structure, no high-level structure. It's used here as a measure of access to and computation of some form of syntactic representation. And that's compared in turn with normal prose, where there's both normal incremental syntactic interpretation, but also semantic interpretation. And that's one behavioural task, which is also run in the scanner. And then outside the scanner, among other things, we use a standard a reversible sentence test, where the patients hear a sentence and they have to choose which of 3 pictures it goes with. So there's a particular relationship between the girl and the woman is pushing the girl is pushing the woman, and that's clearly the right one. And patients with left hemisphere damage have no problems here, where the canonical order of the elements coincides with or matches the canonical order of the action they need to pick out. And this is a lexical distractor. Here's a woman, and she's teaching the girl, and that can be rejected on semantic grounds. And where patients with left hemisphere damage have problems is when you have sentences where the order of elements in the utterance are syntactically reversed, so that you can't conclude from that the girl, it's not girl push woman, but in fact woman push girl. And patients with left hemisphere damage, which involves this left hemisphere circuit, will tend to incorrectly choose this answer again, rather than the correct answer, which is this one. So it's and by the way, in the work I did in Polish with Polish left hemisphere patients, the reversible sentence test we're using case marking simply didn't seem to work. They had no problems with reversed order. I don't know. We never followed that up. If anybody knows anything about that, please talk to me about it afterwards. So two aspects of the results are important here. One is variation in left hemisphere LIFD damage is the only factor that correlates with variation in syntactic processing capacities, where they're measured by this ability to extract some sequential constraint from anomalous prose, and by the presence or absence of distribution of reverse role errors in the reversible sentences, so word position effects to anomalous prose. At the same time, this variation in left hemisphere LIFD damage doesn't affect language comprehension when syntactic cues are not required in order to get the right answer. And again, measured by word position performance and the sorts of errors they make in the reversible sentences. So one slide here on fMRI activation and monitoring performance. So they're in the scanner, the patients, as well as control groups, and they're making a button pressing response to the target. And what we're focusing on here is the difference between anomalous prose and random word order. So that's the difference between performance here and performance there. So and this is the sort of distribution of areas that were active in the patients, but the only activation cluster which correlates with performance on the relevant comparisons, namely the word position effect, were this LIFG cluster. So to the extent that the patient showed activation in this area, they showed a significant word position effect. Activation in RIFG did not correlate with syntactic performance. So that's one kind of evidence. Involving functional activation. Another measure is brain-wise at least I switched my phone off. Brain-wise measures of tissue integrity in relation to behavioural measures. So now you've got a whole brain structural scan. At each voxel, you can estimate the integrity, given the signal of that voxel. You then do a whole brain correlation of variations in intensity across individuals, with individuals, with their performance on various tasks. And in fact, the two tasks here being the word monitoring task and the performance in the reversible sentences. And what you see, and where you find a correlation between loss of tissue integrity, damage, and performance, is first of all you find it clustered in this is different levels of threshold, in left IFG, and extending further out as you lower the threshold, and there's a significant correlation with word position effects in anomalous prose, that is whether you get faster when the target is later in the sentence relative to random word order, and whether you make lexical distractor errors or reverse role errors in the you don't make lexical, whether you make reverse role errors in the reversible sentences. That is, when you see the woman was pushed by the girl, you fail to use the syntactic information to reverse the order of the agent and patient. So both those aspects of performance correlate with damage in that area. And it's one of the important points about using patients is that you make stronger causal inferences about the relationship between the brain system, an area of the brain, and the performance. And it's less clear what causal inferences you can draw if you're looking at activation. It's not saying you can't draw those inferences, but they're going to be less different in nature. And then finally, we looked at tract status. If you remember, there's these, we can't really see it perhaps, but there's the Broca-Wernicke dorsal tracts, and then there's the later ventral tracts connecting frontal lobes, temporal lobes, posterior frontal lobes to dorsal and ventral inferior frontal gyri. And in these same patients, we looked at the status of their, using DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, looked at the status of the tracts in the patients. All the right hemisphere tracts are intact, so only left hemisphere patients. And what you see is that intact, both dorsal and ventral tracts are required to maintain syntactic performance for both word monitoring and reversible sentences. So if you look at the word monitoring, again, anomalous prose and the word position effects, the size of the effect is just as good for the patients if both those tracts are intact, and then very poor if they aren't. The reversible sentence effect, reversible sentence test, reverse role errors shoot up as soon as one of the as soon as one of the tracts is disrupted. But there are no effects of this on the lexical distractor errors, and no effects of left hemisphere tract status on either the reversible sentence measures of semantic interpretability or the normal prose word monitoring. So evidence for, and I've gone into that because I think it's important to understand that there's a strong, real body of evidence that supports this differentiation between different aspects of language function and their relative dissociability. It doesn't mean that normally they work independently, far from it. So evidence of separability, left hemisphere damage that disrupts the perisylvian language network, affects syntactic performance. Right hemisphere can't take over, but it still leaves intact basic capacities for spoken language comprehension. There used to be some studies on patients, typically with massive left hemisphere damage after a middle cerebral artery infarct, showing they were called asyntactic comprehenders because they, most aphasic patients can actually understand quite well what you're saying to them. It's when you're dependent on syntactic cues to have difficulties. This system can continue to function even in the context of massive damage to the left hemisphere. So that overall picture then supports this picture of language communication not as a single monolithic system which supports the whole process, but rather as a coalition of two or maybe more interacting brain systems. So then we need to ask, well, what do these different systems contribute? How are core language functions distributed across these systems, if they are distributed at all? There are strong claims that they aren't. There's also the question of why is the left hemisphere perisylvian system critical? This was what various people have talked about. Anna was talking about in her talk. Is it because it supports specifically linguistic combinatorial functions? and or is it because of this language processing involves particular domain general cognitive control effects and so forth? And then how linguistic are these supposed bihemispheric contributions and so forth? Unfortunately, I don't feel I have a clear answer to those, but I do feel reasonably convinced that this is the way in which we need to think about the resolution of these problems. Now, the left hemisphere combinatorial hypothesis, unsurprisingly, is stated most strongly in the Chomskyan tradition, as the extraordinary Hauser, Fitch, and Chomsky paper. Extraordinary because it's really bizarre that Chomsky should be writing a paper with people with whom he was in bitter controversial conflict just 2 or 3 years beforehand, like Hauser and Fitch and so forth. But it views the evolution of language in terms of the faculty of language broad, faculty of language narrow. We're focused here on faculty of language narrow, claimed to be human unique, a core property of recursion, take two things and make a third, and a claim, and you see this claim expressed in more neurobiologically, neuroscientifically legitimized terms by Berwick, Federici, Bollhaus, and Chomsky. More recently, this core combinatorial linguistic function reserved neurobiologically to the left hemisphere perisylvian system. Now we can start to evaluate these related issues in the domain of morphological combination, where indeed two or more basic elements are combined to form a third, and so forth. Is this core linguistic function reserved neurobiologically to the left hemisphere perisylvian system? I'll start with English inflectional and derivational morphology. Entirely redundant definition, but I suppose you need to know what I think I'm working on. So really, although there are free morphemes that carry free grammatical morphemes, and focusing on bound morphemes, marking key grammatical properties and relations, and there's two particularly important properties from the point of view of the functional interpretation of inflectional morphology and the dynamic processes of language communication. One is that these morphemes are meaning-preserving, sort of definitionally, so create new forms of the same word, but they're not new words. Jumps is not a word that means something different from jump semantically, but it has its grammatical role is defined slightly more, etc. And they're context sensitive, and I think that's particularly important, that these bound morphemes are linked to stems in ways that reflect predictable interactions with the grammatical environment in which that stem and its associated affixes is functioning. Agreement functions are an obvious answer of that, but there are many other types of morpheme that are also context sensitive one way or another. And there's lots of neuropsychological evidence that an intact left hemisphere system is required to comprehend and produce inflectional morphemes. Again, some of the work that Ollie Tyler, for example, has done, and I've also done that demonstrates that. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to just focus on work with intact populations, typically university students. Those being the subjects one gets. And this is a study done in particular with Mirjana Božić, where we contrasted types of lexical processing complexity, linguistic complexity defined as some form of morphological, morphosyntactic complexity. We looked at regularly inflected forms, segmentable. This is in English, obviously segmentable into stem plus a grammatical affix, and where these segmentation processes are triggered by the presence of this, we'll call this English inflectional rhyme pattern. And I'll say something about that more in a minute. But that's this characteristic. Every regular inflectional morpheme in English, or the ED set and the S set, have this property of being realized by a coronal stop that agrees in voice with a previous segment. So trade could be the past tense of tray. It's not, trade is hard to use as a verb, whereas trait, it's coronal stop, but doesn't agree in voice, couldn't be interpreted as a past tense. And something like blend, where blend is not a stem in English, would be the past tense of blend if blend was a word, and so forth. And this segmentation process is stripping off these morphemes will evoke further morphosyntactic processes linked to the presence of a grammatical morpheme. So just a bit more about an inflectional rhyme pattern and the sorts of stimuli. So here's prayed, trade, trend. You've got your vowel, you've got the closure, and then you've got the release. Obviously, these are words produced in isolation. If you're saying this in a sentence, you typically don't release, but never mind. And this is what we call the inflectional rhyme pattern. This closure followed by release, where this is coronal and agrees in voice, and so forth. And what we're looking at is what's going on in stimuli like that. Then we compare that processing complexity associated with the presence of the important point here is that here you have an actual you're accused to the presence of an inflectional morpheme, and there is an inflectional morpheme. That is the past tense of pray. Whereas this isn't. It could be an inflectional morpheme, but it isn't, and so forth. But here, life is complicated because tray is a stem, so it could have a past tense morpheme, although it doesn't because it's hard to use as a verb, or it could use it as a verb. Have you trayed all the plates that are run? Believe me, it's okay for native speakers. But trend couldn't be because trend is not a stem, so it couldn't have an affix on it. And we'll be looking at that interaction between those variables in a minute in a different experiment. But this experiment compares processing complexity to do with the processing of a linguistically relevant inflectional morpheme with processing complexity based on perceptual competition. And I suppose I am most strongly associated with cohort notion, going back to Jistovich and the dynamic incremental speech recognition. And this core claim that there's competition between items that are similar to each other activated from word onset, and it's strongest for forms like claim, which have a fully embedded competitor stem like clay, compared with a form like dream, which has no embedded stem. Dree is not a word in English by and large. And that's arguably distinct from linguistic sources of processing complexity. This is not something to do with combinatorial integration, but competition between perceptual alternatives, which is a very general problem that perceptual systems have to solve, and likely to engage frontotemporal selection functions bilaterally. They may be temporal rather than frontal, but that's another story. And in this experiment, this is in PNAS about 4 or 5 years ago, 4 years ago, we compared regular past tenses like prayed, which has an embedded stem, some theoretical discussion there, and it has the ILP, pseudo-regulars, embedded stem, cues to a possible inflectional morpheme, blend, no embedded stem, and so forth, and then claim, which has the embedded stem but no ILP, and this dream case or cream case that has neither. And this was run as an fMRI experiment. One of the first things we did was to run principal components analysis of the brain-wide neural patterns. So people were just listening to these words in the case of making a gap detection task. The brain-wide neural patterns, and saying, if you look at these patterns, and you don't tell the principal component analysis that these are the distinctions you should make, you just give them the data. And a number of components emerge. The largest component by far is the competition embedded stem component, which separates out the the items that have an embedded stem, namely claim, trade, and prayed, from items like blend and dream that don't have an embedded stem. But it also found another component, which we call a morphological IRP component, which separates out items which have an IRP from items which don't. And you see that trade falls to different sides of the line, for example, depending on whether you're looking at it from the point of view of its embedded stem or if you're looking at it from the point of view of its IRP component. Now, this is really interesting, but what's more interesting is the mapping of this distinction onto the brain. So, again, we have the orange, the stem component, and the blue, the IRP component. And the blue component, and the orange component is very bilateral. Bilateral, it's temporal, and it's frontal. Whereas the IRP component is almost entirely left lateralized, and it has this centered around BA45, extending slightly up to 44 down to 47. There's this anterior temporal lobe, and then bits of stuff back here in posterior MTG, and also this mysterious ITG effect. But the important point is that there's the blind process of perceptual PCA is separating out these two components which fall into these sort of two hypothesized classes and locating them in ways that make sense in the context of a dual systems approach. We went on to univariate analyses, classic subtractions with a auditory baseline. The simple words like cream, bilateral, more posterior MTG activation. The words with the embedded stem, this is just if you lower the threshold, you see more temporal activation. Words with the embedded stem, claim, you get bilateral IFG, this is the peak activations, bilateral IFG, BA47 primarily, wandering up slightly into BA45. Words with the IRP ending, only activating BA45. And this is the signal plots in the main areas, and you can see the right inferior frontal cortex is not at all interested in either blend or dream. It's only interested in the ones which have embedded stems, whereas NIFG is more. This is a bit more like stem competition. Now, I want to take a sort of slight diversion into work on the same data set using MEG, EEG, and RSA, because it's relevant. I think first of all, I think it's the kind of research one's going to have to be doing in order to get to grips with what's going on, and it's not only relevant to the claims I'm making here, but also relevant to the last piece of data which I'm going to show you, which is from Chinese. Now, Anastasia Klimov-Smith mentioned this sort of approach in her talk, where we look at the electrophysiological activity of the brain, and we get as soon as possible into this combined MEG-EEG source space using MNE distributed source reconstructions. And then we search this, so it's reconstructed, dynamic, very noisy, but the best we can get, representation of the neural activity of the brain as people are listening to these sorts of trade and prayed and so forth words. So you use structure MR for each participant to map the white and grey matter cortical boundary, and then you reconstruct the distributed activity over the entire cortical sheet. Now, what we then want to do is to search this representation. Here's a spotlight. It's a spatio-temporally defined spotlight window which moves over the entire brain and 5 milliseconds by milliseconds over the entire epoch, looking for neurocomputational activity which is consistent with theoretical claims. And these are expressed, also do this using ROIs, but this is searchlight basis, and these are expressed in the RSA framework as correlation matrices. So you have the data matrix, which is you have your conditions, or you could have your individual items, bigger matrix, and then you have, and you enter into cells of the matrix a correlation at any particular measurement point between activity for condition 1 to condition 2 through to condition n, and so forth. And that enables you to construct at every searchlight measurement point. So we're looking at, you're looking at this thing moving around step by step, and you're looking at it in time as well. And you're asking, does this match a theoretical model? Now, what we did in this research, we looked for a phonological model, IRP model, and a morphological model. So we're looking for, and this, the sort of what the model is claiming is also illustrated here. Whether it's helpful or not, I'm not quite sure. So this model, so I want to find a part of the brain where played and trend or trade, depending on the condition, are being treated as more similar to each other than they are to any other cells, and as being different from the cream case. So this is what you're hoping it picks out, and we've filtered out the prosodic effects because they're a compound here. That's picking up brain activity related to the identification of a potential morpheme. Of course, it's not a real morpheme because it turns out this is not, in those cases, that's a different class from that. And this is the model RDM, the model representational dissimilarity matrix, which at every searchlight point you're looking at the fit between that and your data matrix. And indeed, you do find fit. So this is an RDM, data RDM, from left Heschel's gyrus, about 25 to 5 milliseconds before recognition point, so forth. And there you can see the blue means that they were similar to each other, the red is not. And so that's when you see a result, that's what you're finding. And similarly then with a morphological model, which says, find me the parts of the brain where the items that make up play are treated as similar, where the items that make up trend and cream are not. I mean, are treated as dissimilar. So this is separating out played from trend and trade. And again, if the system will find, if there are such, it finds them. And here's an example in BA44, about 45 to 65 milliseconds after the closure. You see, for example, neural activity which fits that model. Now, then we try to represent this. One way of representing this is a movie. So I'm going to show you 2 or 3 movies. And one point about the movies is what you're seeing is not activation. This is much derived from activation. This is significance of model fit. Right? It may look like activation, but it's not activation. So this is a phonological model, and its 0 is IRP onset. There's nothing on the right in any of this. You start to see activity appearing, Heschel's gyrus down here, and a lot of temporal lobe activity. Not very much IRP activity, and it all dies away by about this point. I'll start again. So this is left half of the brain. This is the activity model fit for the phonological model. This is finding the finding the possible present IRP. It's STG, HG, STG, temporal lobes, activity going back down here, quite a lot of insular activity, and then there's no fit to that model by the time you get to IRP closure. The morphological model, this is now looking for, that's this model, and it's looking for things like that. It doesn't care where they are, obviously, wherever it finds them. And by the way, these are whole brain searches. So what you're seeing here is not inside a mask, but it's the way the model finds the fits. Sorry, that's the morphological model. And this is much trickier for the brain to sort out, in a sense, because play and tray are both stems. They could both have. It takes much longer to sort it out. If you look at this, there's the same pattern early on, and then after about here, you start getting lots of activity up here. BA44. There's still this insular activity. BA45 turns up around about here somewhere. I hope. Yes, that's right. Yes. So there's much more inferior frontal activity in the context of this model, where the presence of a real inflectional morpheme is being separated from a potential, but not in fact existing morpheme. But remember, this is finding areas where plaid is treated as the same, but different from trend and cream, and where trend and cream are the same. So I want to show you, this is the same, the two at once. All that tells you is that they're very similar until you get to about here, and then you start seeing more activity, as you notice, up here. Coming back then to the stream I was talking about before, the fMRI stream, so this is, again, evidence for separability of frontotemporal processes engaged by inflectional morphemes, consistent with a decompositional account of inflectional morphology. And at the same time, this is not the MAGE stuff, but the fMRI stuff, evidence for effective bilateral frontotemporal systems that underpin the perceptual analysis of spoken inputs and their mapping onto lexical representation, and we get these strong effects of perceptual competition. And the question we then ask is, if we, first of all for English, does derivational morphology engage these systems in the same way? And derivational morphology, as I'm defining it for the purposes of this research, changes the meaning and grammatical category of stems, creates new lexemes, so there's new words in the language and in the brain. They're context independent, they're now contextually relevant agreement functions, for example. And there are long-standing theoretical disputes about whether, and under what conditions, derivational forms are represented as whole forms or decompositionally represented in processing, and those predictions can obviously be related to different predictions about alignment with a specialized left hemisphere system or with bilateral systems. Now this is a study that Mariana and I and others did. It came out at JCN last year, where we essentially transposed, to some extent transposed into the derivational domain aspects of the study with inflectional morphemes, and in particular we have this potential storedness gradient where we have transparent derived forms, transparent in terms of the relationship between the meaning of the stem and the meaning of the proposed form, with a productive affix, productive meaning an affix that's used currently to produce new forms rather than being used a lot in the history of the language, and then progressively more likely to be stored items like warmth with a non-productive affix, archer, which clearly can't be stored as arch plus if you want to get the meaning right, and so forth. And again, in a similar fMRI experiment, and what we get is no LFG activation. We get bilateral, fairly posterior temporal activation, and we get RIFG activation. And essentially get the same effect wherever we look. And if you look in here, despite the fact that the effect's not significant, you see that the same pattern where the The Bravely forms, the transparent, productive ones, are relatively little interest to the system in terms of univariate intensity, and what it responds to are degree of storedness and, as it turns out, competition between the stored whole form and the embedded stem, and so forth. No effect specific to LIFG or the LIFG entity circuit, even for Bravely cases. Instead, you get these nonlinear effects of storedness, which reflect competition between the whole form and the embedded stem. So you get stronger response to Archer if it's relatively less frequent than the embedded stem, and so forth. There's an absence of competition effects with Bravely stimuli, indicating that they do have some sort of internal structure, but it's not invoking the LIFG. And evidence that processing representation of English derivational morphology handled by the bihemispheric system. In particular, what it seems to be saying that derivational morphemes in a language like English are not treated as semi-independent elements that sort of move into the sort of ongoing analysis process to drive utterance interpretation in the same way that an inflectional morpheme seems to be, whether it's an agreement marker or an aspect marker, or in more interesting languages like than English, an evidential marker, so forth, and so on. Right. So then the obvious answer is, given this two sets of claims about English inflexionally complex words and the derivationally complex words, and their mapping onto the different underlying systems, how generalizable is this, and how far is it a consequence of the specific properties of English? I'll try not to spill my water this time. So, distributionally, very restricted inflectional system, only 3 regular affixes, and these affixes are distributionally extreme, so we don't have inflection classes, we just have regular past tenses and then some jump that you have to learn. Thousands, almost any noun in English can be a regular past tense. Most forms have no inflectional marking, and this the zero inflection, the zero marking issue that we were discussing yesterday. In English, I think it's right. The dog is not. It's not sort of underliningly marked as singular. The derived stem in language is generally the full surface form, so it doesn't have. It can have, but it typically won't have inflectional material added to it. Whereas Slavic languages, more or less the antithesis of these properties. And I think this must be some sort of something to do with my mother that I studied Polish. Maybe I'm psychodynamically trying to compensate for the fact that I rejected her language when I was 4 or something. Anyway, or rejected her when I was 4. If there's any therapists here, we can talk about this later as well. English and Russian are nonetheless, in many ways, typologically more similar to English than not, in the sense they have the same inflectional derivational distinction, and they use primarily concatenative word formation. But on the other hand, they have very rich and complex inflectional systems. I don't really need to go into the details. They differ from English in all the ways that potentially, especially on a sort of distributional account of how representations of languages come to emerge in the minds of the listener. They mark highly on all the ways that English is different. So the question is, do we see the same neurocognitive dissociations as for English in inflectional derivational morphology? So first of all, we did 2 parallel fMRI studies in English. And when I say parallel, it's basically the 2 studies in English I just talked about. We tried to transpose them into the Slavic domain. The first one pits inflectional complexity against stem competition. Do we see selective left hemisphere activation for inflected forms. And our mistake there, as I was pointing out yesterday, is to think that there could be an uninflected form in the Polish verbal or nominal system and so forth. But we still get a result. And then the question is stem competition bilateral? Or does it also engage this? And then we looked at transparent and opaque Polish derived forms, so something like czytanie from czytać, reading, as opposed to something like kanapka, which I think means, I can't remember, it's from canapé, and I can't remember, one of them means sofa, and one of them means sandwich. Anyway, opaque, in fact not derivation related at all. Polish is full of French imports. Probably Russian too. Both studies closely parallel English results. So inflectional complexity, which is a property of all our stimuli, including the dom, masculine accusative, masculine singular, show left lateralized activation of LIFG, not enormously strong and a bit ventral for my liking, but nonetheless. Perceptual complexity shows bilateral frontotemporal effects, with competition between whole forms like cotlet and embedded stem cot. And in the derivational experiment, we see no selective LIFG activation linked to the presence of derivational complexity. So the effects are all temporal. So that's consistent with, I think, a perfectly reasonable conclusion that Polish-derived stems are represented and accessed as stored lexemes, and these lexemes then enter into combination with inflectional morphemes and so forth. But the lexeme itself is not being decomposed, at least not dynamically in comprehension, probably not in productions. And again, in Polish, as in English, the transparent forms like czytanie don't show competition effects. Somewhat stronger evidence for this derivation inflection fit distinction comes from the research that Anna talked about yesterday. Just to remind you, and I'm not talking about the inflection syntax contrast, but the inflection derivation contrast where you've got either simple or complex inflected forms, and then you've got simple and complex derivational forms. This is forms of back form, I mean, stripping off the affix from that form. Prikash, and then you're a Heravoshik, a complex derivational form. And the results are surprisingly straightforward. Simple derivation only, this is all univariate. It's all in the univariate world. Multivariate world, probably different. I don't really want to know how different it is, but anyway. Simple derivation, strong bilateral temporal, no difference between simple and complex derivation, whereas the inflections certainly issue bilateral temporal, but you see this selective left frontotemporal activation, 45, even this is 40, 47, 44, and 45 underlyingly. So striking parallels between English and Slavic in how inflectional derivation morphology play out across the hypothesized dual systems, and we see little effect in these kinds of measures of the sort of distributional complexity differences that are obviously very salient when you look overall at Slavic language systems and English language systems. I don't have time here to go into detail of the seemingly parallel results in Finnish, Lena, Alina, Leitonen, so forth, and so have been interesting research that they've been producing over the last 3 or 4 years. When I say seemingly parallel, this is not to say that what they report and how Alina, for example, Alina talks about it is indeed in a way that's consistent with this derivational inflectional split. But I think it's not as black and white. I think if you look at the dynamic activation patterns for derivational inflectional morphemes, there's more bilateral activation for the inflectional and so on and so forth. And also there are, obviously not only the language differences, but also there are various task differences and so forth. So exactly how what they've been doing relates to what we've been doing is a more complicated story than I can talk about here. And I think Yuri might want to comment on this voice allowing. He and Friedemann have done a number of experiments, and some of them well predating any of the stuff I've talked about, using EEG and MEG to look at inflectional derivational in Finnish and in English. I think that I would regard them as being largely parallel, but not entirely. So these sets of parallels invite broader generalizations about universals. Don't worry, I've just got 2 more languages and then we can stop. Inflectional morphemes are related to combinatorial morphostatic functions engaged in LRG. Derivational morphology generates new lexemes whose affixes don't seem to be accessed or processed decompositionally by a specialized left hemisphere system. Well, if you keep looking, and in particular you look at Arabic, Arabic is very different from any of those you looked at in a number of respects, and in particular this distinctive non-concatenative procedures for word formation. And I'm not going to talk about non-root and pattern approaches to Arabic. I've had many arguments with people like Rosishkin and so forth, and I think that psycholinguistically they're just wrong. You can't deal with the empirical data unless you've got word patterns. I'm happy going to talk about that afterwards. So we're assuming a root and word pattern approach, where a surface form like batar, to cut off, is made up of a root, typically a triconsonantal root, with a semantic domain of cutting, although it may have other semantic domains it also participates in, and a word pattern. And the F and the thing are just consonantal placeholders. It's the prosodic pattern and the vowels that define the word pattern. And the word pattern provides morphosyntactic and phonological information, arguably applies to all Arabic surface forms except for a subset, the function words. So if you have a root, Kötteber is the famous root to do with writing, at least 28 different derived surface forms, both in the verbal and the deverbal nominal morphology, where different word patterns. So here's a word pattern with three syllables and 3 vowels, gives you a verbal form, write, and this is also part of the verbal morphology. It gives you a nominal form, writer, book, correspondence, and so forth. So 2 important points here. One is that psycholinguistic research, insofar as psycholinguistic research can tell you anything about what's going on, it's telling you Arabic word forms are strongly decompositional. There's strong evidence that the system of extracting roots, extracting word patterns, is doing so dynamically as you listen to or read Arabic forms. And that's also partially true in Hebrew. Hebrew is different in certain ways, which just create confusion in the minds of people who think that all Semitic languages are the same. Arabic word patterns, but the crucial thing here is Arabic word patterns, they clearly have both inflectional and derivational properties. So the combination of the root with the word pattern is creating a new lexeme, like book, there's different meaning from writer, but they also have inflectional properties, especially in the verbal morphology. So how is that going to play out in this nice, tidy framework? So what we try to do is combine non-concatenative complexity, this interleaving roots and word patterns, and concatenative complexity. Because Arabic not only has this non-concatenative word formation, it also has affixes, very standard inflectional affixes marking person, gender, and number, which fit onto the stem created by the non-concatenative interleaving roots and word patterns. And then that allows them to construct a gradient from simple function words to non-concatenatively complex words to concatenatively complex words. So, and you don't need the details of all this. We've got simple words. There's a subclass of function words which can't be decomposed into roots and word patterns. They just don't fit the criteria for doing that. Then you've got functional words, and then primitive nouns, verb nouns, and verbs, all of which can be realised as just as a root and a word pattern with no extraneous material, say kalb, dog, and so forth. And then you can take one of these forms and add an affix to it. So you have something like katamu. Katam is the stem, and u is to do with the person number marking. So the word pattern morphing has both derivational and inflectional properties. How will it play out in terms of LRG selectivity, whereas the affix morphemes we expect just to affect LRG. So we've got these results which univariately are fairly clear-cut. Simple words, bilateral temporal, that's not really there, it's just sort of bleeding through from the representation. It's not significant in any case. Bilateral temporal activation, and root and word pattern non-concatenative, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, this should be the other way around, never mind. And you get strong, selective, highly selective LIFG activation, you can see there, not a sign of anything univariately on the right. And when you look at the affix case, so you know you've got the katam, we've added this inflectional affix, you get basically the same result. And these aren't significantly different from these. Again, strong LIFG, selective LIFG, no RIFG. So, despite their joint derivation inflectional properties, these Arabic word forms seem to engage the left hemisphere frontotemporal system preferentially. These word forms are decompositionally analysed, not treated as stored whole forms. I mean, if this was Polish, you'd expect katam to be treated as a undecomposed lexeme. It clearly isn't. And the psycholinguistics of Arabic would say it isn't as well. It's not, the two different domains of discourse do actually connect. So the derivational inflectional contrast no longer seems to coincide with the separable contributions of left hemisphere and bilateral systems. And if you think I'm going to come up with answers to these paradoxes, I'm not. But certainly these results sharpen the question of what triggers the engagement of LRG. One possibility is that it's to do with morphological parsing. So inflectional forms in English, Slavic or whatever require parsing to separate the stem from the affix, so you can then use the affix to go off and do the grammatical things you need it for. And non-concatenative forms in Arabic also need parsing, complex parsing, to extract the roots from the word patterns. It's not straightforward because the word patterns sometimes have consonants, which looks as if they might be part of the roots and so forth. And it could well be the cognitive demands of these access processes that are critical here. But Anna's results, where she doesn't have any difference of effects in morphological complexity, are not fully consistent with this. And we don't know enough to resolve this, I don't think we do. But I'd like to finish off with Mandarin Chinese. Another language I'm very fond of because I have no maternal or other links to it. And this is work done by another graduate student, Yun, who worked extremely hard. And this, the trouble working with Meg source spaces, it's very demanding. And what she did is compare compounds of bisyllabic forms in Mandarin. Now, Mandarin actually has no inflectional morphology except for a few aspect tense markers. But it's controversial linguistically, are these inflectional, and so on and so forth. But there's practically no derivational morphology. The primary means for creating word forms in Chinese is by compounding. And there's a huge need in Chinese to create new word forms because the morphology is so restricted. There only are about 1,600 possible syllables. So to get new words, you have to combine them, and they do that by compounding. So the question is, if we look at what's going on when these things are being interpreted, do we see anything at all equivalent to what we see in English or Polish? Well, in English in this case, because it's only in English that we've done this parallel kinds of experiment. So you have these are isolated bisyllabic forms with the first constituent and the second constituent. The second constituent reveals the word type, and through multivariate pattern analysis of the type I've described to you half an hour ago, and we look for inflection model, derivation model, and compound model. That is, are there parts of the brain which group together all the inflected items more than other items, and where it's different from all the others? So it's a detector model. It's a crude model, but it can be effective. Derivation model, there's no significant effects, not surprisingly. Compound model, as is in the movie, this is a sort of freeze frame movie. So this is model fit over time, left and right, and this is time from the onset of the second morpheme. So we're going from 120 milliseconds through to 400 or so milliseconds, and there's what's significant. All of this is corrected for multiple comparisons, by the way. And the compound model is quite strongly bilateral, and noticeably it doesn't involve on the left LIFG at all. It doesn't involve these frontal temporal areas. And the inflection model starts off with this massive activation on the right, which we think is probably to do with prosody, but we don't know. But then you start seeing selective activation, BA44, BA45 coming in, and anterior temporal regions. So about 200 milliseconds after the onset of the second syllable, you start getting this pattern of selective activation, which we've argued and seen in other languages associated with the presence of an inflectional morpheme. And yeah, I think it's remarkable to find this, given the lack of salience of inflectional morphology in the English language like Chinese. And I don't want to over-interpret it, but it does suggest pervasive engagement of left hemisphere frontal temporal circuits by inflectional morphemes. And you could argue that these results are less likely to be driven by segmentation demands, although there's an element of clinicization for the aspectual markers. But it may reflect the primary role of a left hemisphere pericyclic system, not so much in supporting cognitive control, but it's more interesting, perhaps, role in sort of hierarchical compositionality of language interpretation and the specialized functions of inflectional morphemes in guiding this process. I mean, certainly in the sort of general neurobiological evolutionary framework, inflectional morphology, when it's there, seems to be intersecting with parts of the brain system that are involved in supporting full human language function. And that's probably a clue for something important, but quite what it is, I don't know. I'll leave it to the next generation. In any event, scientifically explanatory accounts of language communication then really need to take into account neural systems and subsystems that support these capacities. That requires an integration of neuroimaging behavioral and linguistic inputs, and absolutely have to work cross-linguistically. Thank you. I'm sorry to have gone on so long. It's Yuri's fault. He said I had an hour and a quarter.
Thank you so much. I think we still have time for questions. So if there are such, please. Mm-hmm.
What are the special temporal results for Arabic? Do they use left hemisphere extensively from the very beginning of the word?
I haven't done this in Arabic. I haven't done the EEG in Arabic, unfortunately. I mean, we've done incremental mass priming. It's not quite the same thing. Yeah, so you start to see very early the root is root primary effects, and then the word pattern effects are coming in about 20 seconds later. But I'm not sure that's going to answer. It doesn't tell you anything about hemispheres, that's for sure.
Yes, Andrei.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is about inflection and derivation. These concepts are kind of tricky in many ways, and linguists are struggling with them very much. Some propose that they should be dropped altogether. Some other postulate all kinds of intermediate processes. But my question is the following. When we are talking about English or Slavic inflection derivation features, which are, after all, not that different, as you pointed out, we are thinking simultaneously about two different things. One, on the semantic side, the list of categories that can be expressed in an inflectional way, such as tense, person, number, a couple of more. And on the other hand, we are looking at the structural technique of how this is implemented in morphology. If we are taking this Indo-European languages as the benchmark and want to compare them to other languages, we have two possibilities. One is to look for languages that have similar or different structural techniques. But on the other hand, we can see how other languages express the ideas of time and number and person, irrespective of the morphological structure. So what do you think about these two possibilities? Well, my point is that inflection is not really a unitary concept. It's very internally heterogeneous.
Yeah, no, I think I absolutely agree that inflection isn't a unitary concept. And I mean, Anna, for example, is focusing on the role of inflection in grammatical relations, telling you that this agent is related to the subject, whatever it might be, and so forth. I mean, the past tense is not relational in that way. It's telling you about how to interpret this utterance in a tense aspect, framework, in English, so on and so forth. I think one of the things we do need to do is to break down the sort of functional roles that inflectional morphemes are carrying out and look at them, of course, linguistically. I mean, you certainly can't do neuroimaging with every interesting language that you come across, quite apart from the expense. You can't, you go to a wonderful language that's spoken in the hilltop in the Caucasus or whatever it is, you just can't get that kind of data rationally. I don't quite know how I would proceed in exploiting all the different kinds of possibilities that the modern languages provide. I'm certainly, you started off saying, well, the inflection derivation distinction is tricky. And there's certainly a very large grey zone that people are arguing about. I mean, I tried to pick out sort of simple minded properties of inflection and derivation that are relevant to kinds of experiments we could do. Whether at some level one wants to abolish the whole distinction between derivational morphemes creating lexemes and inflectional morphemes as modulating the grammatical interpretation or modulating the interpretation of a stream at many different levels of description as you're hearing it. I mean, for some languages that may well be the right way to think about it. I mean, Finnish is gluterative, so it's different from, I suppose, those languages. Maybe if one pokes around more in languages like that, where you get all Turkish and so forth. I mean, languages where you have native speakers that you can bring into the EEG level and make that, and so on and so forth. Maybe one could get more leverage on. I keep expecting to find. I mean, when we did the work on Polish, I wouldn't have been surprised to have found environment in which it occurs. So, yeah. There are also, I don't have a single specific answer to your question.
Usually, inflectional forms are much more, processing on inflectional models are much more sensitive to syntactic context than derivational models. With this regard, do you think that neuroimaging will differ depending on whether you present isolated forms, both inflectional and derivational, or forms within context in connected speech?
Well, I would hope that they don't differ fundamentally. But the way that an inflectional marker functions in interpretation, in an utterance, in a phrase or an utterance in a context, it seems to be very different. I mean, you've got a framework in terms of which you're looking to use that information. But I would hope at this point that there wouldn't be some fundamental qualitative difference in the neurocognitive machinery that extracted this information and used it to interpretation. But certainly a limitation of most of this work is done with single words. So, yeah,
Thank you.
need to be aware of that issue.
Thank you for the lecture. There is a piece of data puzzling me for years, and I'd like to ask you for your comment about it. It concerns the data discussed by Elizabeth Bates and her critics of the modularity approach to the mind, to the speech. And it concerns early brain lesions in children before 6 months old, with lesions affecting speech zones, especially Broca zones. These kids have got normal speech development, a little bit delayed, but reaching the normal level. In 40% of the cases using left hemisphere, and 40% of the cases using the right hemisphere, and in the rest 20% of the cases using both hemispheres. How are these data could be interpreted in your dual system framework?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, the effects of development of early brain injury. I think maybe I've read more about the effects of hemispherectomy than about other things because it's slightly clearer what's happened. So my impression of the effects of early hemispherectomy, when you lose the entire hemisphere for usually perinatal damage reasons or congenital reasons, is that indeed these children do remarkably well, but their language is not clear. Their language is fully, full syntactic language function. I mean, one problem is that these children are not always tested using methods that really give you the clear information you want about, for example, sort of core syntactic aspects, because you can perform. I mean, unless you have exactly the right kinds of contrasts, other kinds of cues will help you perform very well. And then there's the evidence that's coming out from work with people like Gillane, Dehaan and others, where you look at the brains of neonates and the experience prenatally and so on and so forth, and you already see quite some degree of left hemisphere specialization for certain kinds of things, so forth. I don't think that, whatever the outcome is of these, that this is inconsistent with this claim. I mean, what I'm claiming is that the bilateral system can support a very considerable degree of language function, and if all you've got is the right hemisphere, then it's not going to have whatever particular properties the left hemisphere has. So I mean, the problem with having a hemispherectomy is that you've got much less brain available to before, not just learning language. So if the level is slightly lower, it might be for that reason rather than more interesting reasons. Yeah. I think the so one positive implication I would draw from this approach is that one should not underestimate the residual community capacities of individuals, either through developmental disorders or damage or later damage, even in the absence of intact respiratory organ system. And indeed, much of the evidence for originally hypothesizing and separating out these things comes from evidence for the community capacities of people with left hemisphere damage.
Yes, I had similar question. Would you agree then that critical age for first language acquisition is critical for a certain part of the brain, the frontal left? Or that depends on if it's a Chinese child who is supposed, if it's a baby who is supposed to acquire Chinese, that has different important features. Would it be the same neuronal structure, which is critical?
Well, I don't know is my answer. But, I mean, I mean, languages which have little in the way of explicit inflectional systems use other means for conveying the same kind of information that was conveyed grammatically. And Chinese, very dependent on context, on the use of other kinds of terms to indicate intention aspects and so on and so forth. Now you could hypothesize, I'm not necessarily thinking it's true, that there'd be more bilateral substrate supporting language function and language like that. You could hypothesize that. But I wouldn't expect that to, I don't know why you think that would interact with critical periods and so forth.
Still, we have that critical period. If you, in spite of the fact that the level goes up, but still, if you don't have access to language up to around 6, then you won't. You are not supposed to develop good syntax, at least.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't have any expertise on that particular question.
Mm-hmm. And another question is about talking parrots, for instance. They have very small cortex-less brain. They do not have adequate articulational basis. Still, we have to accept that they can talk, produce sounds, speech-like sounds, and that they have the ability of phoneme analysis, phonemic perception.
Well,
How can they be? They neither have Broca nor Wernicke, absolutely definitely no network of the kind that is supposed to process language. But still, what is it?
Well, I mean, you were talking about the linguistic capacities of Alex.
Yes, of course.
the African grey parrot. Yeah, so I mean, Alex could do some remarkable things. I would hesitate to say that Alex or any African grey parrot would have full human language, symbolic representations, compositional syntax, and so on and so forth. I mean, there is a lively area of research into birdsong, and I mean, humans, we're very different from our primate neighbours, because we're vocal learners and we're capable of generating new streams and so on and so forth. One of the species, for quite evolutionarily distant, that have these capacities are some subspecies of birds, like songbirds and so forth. There are in fact interesting parallels in the kind of brain organisation that you need in order to be able to learn vocal sequences and in particular to generate local sequences. So if you're a chimpanzee or a macaque, you cannot control your vocal apparatus in order to produce differentiated outputs. If you're a songbird, you can do that. It's a very different kind of vocal apparatus. But there's a particular kind of connectivity between basal ganglia and motor cortex and so on and so forth, which has emerged in humans, which you don't see in our primate relatives, and possibly analogous systems that you see in songbirds and so forth. So some of the enabling wiring that you need to have in order to be a language user, and also to be a generator of song, have analogies. And I think that's interesting. But I don't think that means that and the other thing about birds is that there's been quite a move over the last 10 years to re-examine the whole neuroanatomical classification of the bird brain, so that it's no longer seen as being much more similar or relatable to primate brains and so forth. So I think there's quite a lot to be learned from looking at across the species, large species divides like songbirds. But I have to not convince me. I think by the Alex case that Alex really did have the language. We need more. We need more than one case for one thing.
And one more question. Would you agree with Terence Deacon's idea that language is a virus that occupied the brain, so that the brain had to evolve, to co-evolve, to become what it is now?
No, I don't think it's a virus. I think it's a
Metaphorically, of course.
Language and culture allows one to, propagate concepts. And, at least this is a total. But I mean, language itself is the capacity for language, and that's part of the point of being in the macaques, is very much rooted in a million-year evolutionary, tens of millions of years of evolution of all sorts of different functions that together make it possible for human language to emerge. But I think that might then support propagation of thought processes you might call viruses or memes or whatever. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering how you would account for studies by Mainzer and Pliatzikos.
Sorry?
Studies by Mainzer and Pliatzikos. Mainzer, he's a academic. Mainzer, and it's a. No. So I'm talking about authors of articles. Mainzer and Pliatzikos. They wrote some articles on fMRI studies in which they looked at morphologically complex words, more specifically derivations. And they found LIFG activation for morphologically complex derivations, so for derivations. So I was wondering, how would you account for those results? They did not use a priming paradigm. They used lexical decision as a task. Do you have any? Should I write it down?
Any more questions?
No, I don't know that word. I don't think. So I can't really mindset. What was the? Well, maybe we should talk about it afterwards. We tell them about the experiment.
Okay.
Whether you get whether you get IFG activation or not is also very dependent on the task and so forth. But I'm happy to talk about it more deeply.
So we hope time for one more question.
So, yeah, I have a question related to the two questions about the contrast between derivation and inflection. So my question is, if we take forms like jumping or trading, is there any evidence on behalf of the field of brain study that there is that these nominalizing morphemes belong to inflection rather than derivation? And what's then the contrast between such forms and payment or whatever? Yeah.
Well, ing is ambiguous in English between derivation and inflectional. I haven't personally, I've avoided using ing for those reasons because it's ambiguous.
It's on the slide.
What?
It's on the slide, jumping.
Oh, yeah. No, that, right at the beginning, yes. That's the inflectional aspectual use of ing. Yeah. I mean, some of that building, well, it's going to depend on relative frequency and context and so on and so forth. But where it's clear that it's being used inflectionally, I expect it to behave like an inflection, and where it's clear that it's being used derivationally, I expect it to behave derivationally. But it is an inflection.
So, thank you so much. Such a pleasure. So we start the next session at 4. Yes? 4:05? 4:05. Да, 15.